Today, we're going to be talking about how Reagan lifted America out of its depression. So, just as a little recap, we last left off talking about how the 1970s was an era of depression. People lost faith in government due to Vietnam and Watergate, and the pardon of Nixon, and the pardon of the draft dodgers. And we couldn't overcome our dependence on foreign oil. We tried different alternatives to energy, and nothing was working. And then when our hostages were taken in Iran, we couldn't save them, and that was a disaster. And so Jimmy Carter lectured the country about malaise and saying we need to kind of put our just kind of get it together and work hard, and people didn't really want to hear that. And so when Reagan came to office, he kind of lifted America out of its depression based upon his personality and his approach to government. We have this movie star as president. Reagan was a movie star. And so he had that natural ability to shine the way stars do and speak to the American public. Okay, and I started off our discussion with this pendulum because I wanted to talk about American policy over time, that we see American policy shifting towards the right and more conservative, and towards the left, more progressive. And so we've seen that throughout history. And just a little quick recap about that. We have the Gilded Age on the right, and then that led to the progressive era on the left. And then we see the 1920s on the right with a laissez-faire pro-business approach. And then once that crashed, we see the New Deal on the left. And after, we see the 1960s and the civil rights movement. This is all on the left. Women's rights, rights for the accused, affirmative action programs, and now we are seeing this move to the right towards conservative era starting in 1980. And so that's the beginning of this new time period, the ninth unit in our course, this move towards conservatism and the right. And so it's possible that now, with our current situation and the pandemic, and people might feel the need for more government regulation and more government involvement at this time in history. So possibly we could be starting a new era, and it'll start with 1919 COVID. And that will be period 10 in US history for people who are studying it in the future. Just a thought. But in period 9, we see this swing to the right. So let's talk about Reagan, his famous line: government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And then you see spin-offs of that, where people talk about starving the beast, meaning the government is the beast and we need to reduce government funds so we can starve it so it will die in a bathtub. That's what people said. This all goes along with that. So what does this mean? That government programs and regulations are inefficient and interfere with our lives. They actually cause more problems than they solve. And the president would say this because he believed in laissez-faire and deregulation. And what might be the solution? Well, smaller government, fewer regulations. And that would mean repealing regulations that we've discussed over our last unit, and even earlier, like environmental protections, regulations on the media to provide unbiased news called the Fairness Doctrine. That was repealed in the 1980s. And then we see the rise of right-wing news. Regulations on the stock market were repealed. So companies can disperse cash to stockholders in something called a stock buyback, which allows stockholders to make a lot of money. He also wanted to cut back on aid to the poor in the spirit of rugged individualism. Okay, so we see Reagan coming to office, and he also promised to cut taxes. That would be part of this program as well. So I'm just going to add that in. Okay. And so this is just a little summary of what I discussed. Reagan comes in, he wants to reduce the size of government, and this is a little bit of this backlash against the liberal policies of the 60s and the 70s, and we're going to see a lot of that in the next few lessons. Okay, so Reagan brought together a wide group of people, which is known as the Reagan Coalition. And so as he is ruling in the 1980s in power, they try to satisfy all these different groups. So we have religious conservatives. So we have a tremendous increase in power of the religious right. So they organize think tanks, lobbyists, fundraising organizations in response to some of the more liberal policies of the 80s. I mean, of the 70s and 60s, I'm sorry. So Engel, that was the case where the government said that, the Supreme Court said that the government can't have a prayer in school, even if it's non-sectarian, even if it's voluntary. There's no prayer in school. The Roe case allowing women to have control over their bodies in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Miranda, that is establishing the right to the accused to be told of their rights at the time of arrest. So conservatives did not like these rules. We also see populists as part of the Reagan coalition. Then they distrust the Eastern establishment. Their populist message was against a centralized power where distant hostile forces are controlling society and threatening individual freedom. So we see that in the Trump message also. Corporate elites. So these are people who promote free markets and they don't like regulation. So these are the wealthy groups who control business. Then we also see neoconservatives, and they want to reaffirm Western democratic, anti-communist values. And they're against multiculturalism and political correctness and world organizations like the UN and things like that. So we do also see some of these interests still in the Trump administration. But this was what Reagan brought together. And so his administration tried to satisfy all these different groups. And you can see through the accomplishments that you've read through that they really did try to do that. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go over some of these quickly. I'm assuming that you read through these. So we have this arms race, and the Soviet Union couldn't keep up, and they eventually collapsed. And Reagan was very tough against communism expansion around the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere, like in Grenada, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. He came up with this idea called Strategic Defense Initiative, which was going to be a shield, a laser shield around the United States that could intercept weapons that were coming in. But in the 1980s, this was really something that could not work and was very, very expensive, and people kind of mocked it, calling it Star Wars, because it was like some science fiction futuristic idea. Another thing that the Reagan administration was mocked for was this idea about the evil empire, evil versus good. It seemed kind of simplistic. He liberated Grenada from a communist-style government. He embarked on a peacetime military buildup. What else could we say here? He illegally sold arms to Iran through the CIA to supply weapons to people in Nicaragua fighting communism. This is known as the Iran-Contra scandal, and we'll talk more about that another day, but this was absolutely illegal, and people did go to jail for this. But this kind of demonstrates his commitment to fighting communism. We enjoyed 8 years of unbroken peace during the Cold War. And then eventually, of course, the decline of communism, which is a major accomplishment. Domestic policy. He focused on supply-side economics, which is something that we talked about in the 1920s. So this is the same idea, that they're going to cut taxes and reduce government spending. If the government's going to give handouts, it's going to be to big business because they can increase their supply and spend more money, and they'll hire workers that way. But other people, even George H.W. Bush, refer to this as voodoo economics, meaning that it's not really going to work because if you give money to businesses, they may or may not open a new factory. They might give their extra money and savings to stockholders now that they're not limited in stock buybacks anymore. So that's actually one of the things that caused a bigger gap between the rich and the poor starting in the 1980s. Okay, one of the things that Reagan is particularly known for in a positive way is restoring American self-confidence and bringing back this image of America as a city on a hill. Okay, so we're coming from this low level of the 1970s to this higher, stronger position. Okay, so he wound up reducing taxes, the top tax rate from 70% to 28%. And let's take a look at our footnote there. The Economic Recovery Act included a decrease in taxes, and they cut corporate income tax, capital gains tax, gift and inheritance tax. So these are really taxes that the wealthy people are paying. So most of this tax relief went to upper income taxpayers. And so when we look at the growing gap between the rich and the poor, if we looked at it over time, we would really see that it's starting to veer off in opposite directions starting in the 1980s. Okay, what else could we say here? 20 million jobs were created during Reagan's term in office. But the national debt nearly tripled, really due to this enormous military spending. The Republican Party became extremely conservative. So remember that Nixon was a Republican, and he was the one who started the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, Nixon would be considered very, very far left for doing such a thing, and he would not be welcome really in the Republican Party because it has moved so far to the right. So he reduced the size of the federal government. Just looking to see if we need to talk about any of these things. He's reduced regulation on savings and loan institutions, antitrust laws, and environmental protection. And he also took the solar panels off the White House. So remember that Carter tried to move the country towards solar energy by putting panels on the White House, but he removed that. He reduced emissions and auto safety in the auto industry, trying to save the auto industry. He took a tough stand against unions and fired people when they were protesting for better widening the gap between the rich and the poor. He appointed Supreme Court judges, the first woman on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, that's a name to know, but she was very, very conservative. And these judges wound up limiting Roe versus Wade a little bit, allowing states to put on more restrictions on abortion, which we see nowadays. They didn't want to support prayer in school. They wanted to actually have a constitutional amendment promoting prayer in school, I should say. I think I just misspoke there. They wanted prayer in school. They wanted support for religious schools. They wanted to pass an amendment to end abortion, and they fought against the Equal Rights Amendment and teaching sex education in school. And then they cut some funding for the poor, like lunch programs, school lunch programs, and food stamps. Okay, so then we have some ideas about the successes of Ronald Reagan and the failures of Ronald Reagan. And so I pretty much just cut and pasted from some people who had answered this already because I feel like I'm a little bit biased and I didn't want to push my own agenda here. So ideas that show the strength of Reagan, that he bankrupted the Soviet Union. It was an unbroken peace. He dealt toughly with the communist regimes. He increased jobs and confidence of the U.S., lowered taxes, made America more business friendly, and he was a charismatic leader. On the negative side, he did raise income inequality, and they wound up supporting some fascist dictatorships in the name of fighting communism. There was a breakdown of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. We have the Iran-Contra scandal. The tax policy helped the rich. They defunded programs for the poor, pushed conservative values into schools and into the country in general. They loosened policies on environmental protection. The conservative judges on the Supreme Court, which I guess some people might view as a positive. They fired union workers. They opened federal lands for drilling. There was an intrusion into people's private lives, like this anti-gay movement, anti-women's rights movement, and they removed the solar panels from the White House. Okay, and then I asked you to decide, because people look at Ronald Reagan as one of the stars of the Republican Party, and they compare everybody to Ronald Reagan. And so that's something that you should know about. But, you know, many liberals would see this as kind of like a false prophet, that he wasn't really as good as he said because of all of these negatives. And so that's an opinion for you to decide. And that's it for today. Please submit your AIM response. How did he lift America out of its depression? Have a great day, everybody.